The silence before the storm, humanity's return. The chamber of the Concord had never been quiet in living memory. Delegates from 41 worlds filled its curved rows, their voices a constant hum of negotiation, argument, and quiet alliance building. But on the day Earth's fate was decided, the chamber fell into a silence so complete that the soft hiss of the air recyclers could be heard from the highest gallery. Ambassador Elena Voss sat in the human delegation seat, her hands folded on the table in front of her, and listened to a verdict that described a version of her people she did not recognize. The charges were read aloud by the presiding officer in a flat, ceremonial tone. Unauthorized military expansion into contested space. Sabotage of a neutral world's water reclamation system. Concealment of weapons research banned under Concord Treaty. Each accusation was false. Elena knew this the way she knew her own name. And yet, as she looked around the chamber, she saw agreement on almost every face. She had served as Earth's senior ambassador for 9 years. In that time, she had negotiated trade routes, medical exchange programs, and shared research initiatives that had lifted 3 struggling colony worlds out of famine. She had believed, without question, that the Concord valued Earth's presence. That belief did not survive the reading of the verdict. When the vote was called, 38 worlds raised their assent. 3 abstained. None objected. Earth was found guilty, and the sentence was exile, full severance from Concord trade, technology sharing, and diplomatic protection, effective immediately. Elena did not argue. She had learned, in 9 years, that arguing after a vote was already decided only made a delegation look desperate. Instead, she rose, gathered her papers, and led her staff out of the chamber with her spine straight and her expression unreadable. It was not until she was aboard the departure shuttle, watching the golden spires of the Concord's home station shrink behind the viewport, that she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had happened. Her staff sat around her in the shuttle's main cabin, 12 people who had spent years building relationships that no longer mattered. A young researcher named Toma Adeyemi, barely 26 years old, stared out the window with his jaw tight. He had joined the diplomatic corps because he believed in the Concord's promise of shared progress between species. Now he watched that promise dissolve into the black. They didn't even look surprised, he said quietly. When the vote came in, nobody looked surprised. Elena turned to him. That's because it wasn't a surprise to them. This was decided before we ever walked into that room. Toma looked at her. Then why hold the vote at all? Because it needs to look fair, Elena said. Even a lie needs a ceremony. She did not tell him what she suspected, that somewhere behind the verdict was a hand that had shaped the evidence long before the trial began. She did not have proof yet. But 9 years of reading rooms and reading people had taught her to recognize when a conclusion was too smooth, too convenient, too perfectly timed to explain away exactly the kind of expansion Earth had been planning into the frontier systems beyond its borders. 2 days earlier, in a private chamber far from public record, a Concord delegate named Rethvin Suarar had reviewed the final draft of the evidence package with quiet satisfaction. Rethvin represented the Elon Compact, a coalition of trading worlds whose wealth depended on control of the frontier corridor, a stretch of resource-rich space that Earth's survey ships had begun mapping only 3 years prior. Human engineers had found promising deposits of rare stabilizing minerals there, materials the Elon Compact had quietly been mining for over a century without Concord oversight. Rethvin understood, better than most, what would happen if Earth's mining operations expanded into that corridor. Competition would drive down prices. Contracts the Compact had held for generations would be renegotiated, or lost outright. It was, in his calculation, a simple problem with a simple solution. Humanity did not yet have enough allies in the Concord to defend itself against a coordinated accusation, and it would take years, if ever, to prove the evidence had been fabricated. By then, the corridor would belong entirely to the Compact. He had spent 11 months arranging it. Falsified sensor logs. A bribed inspector on a border station. A staged incident at a water facility that could be blamed on human sabotage teams that never existed. It had cost him a considerable fortune and no small amount of patience, but patience was Rethven's specialty. He signed the final trade agreements that would follow Earth's exile with a steady hand, and that evening he allowed himself a rare indulgence, a glass of distilled kaffir wine, watched from his office window as the twin suns of Venaris set behind the station's outer ring. Not everyone in the chamber had voted with such certainty. High Councillor Ith Solen, an elder statesman of the Dravik Assembly, had cast his vote in favor of exile along with the majority, but he had not slept well since. Something about the evidence troubled him, not its content, but its shape. Real intelligence reports were messy. They contained gaps, contradictions, moments where two sources disagreed and someone had to make a judgment call. This evidence had none of that. It was clean in a way that felt manufactured rather than gathered. He told himself, as he had told himself many times before, that clean evidence was not necessarily false evidence. But the thought did not leave him, and in the weeks that followed, he found himself quietly reviewing the case files late into the night, alone, telling no one what he was doing. Aboard the departing shuttle, Elena Voss made a decision that would define the next chapter of her life, though she did not yet know how long that chapter would be. She gathered her staff in the main cabin and spoke to them plainly, without the polished diplomatic language she had used for 9 years. "We are not going home in defeat," she said. "We are going home to build something the Concord did not expect us to build. I don't know how long it will take. It might take longer than any of us want to admit. But I promise you this, we will not spend that time asking to be let back in. We will spend it becoming impossible to exclude." Toma looked at her, uncertain. "What does that mean, practically?" "It means we stop depending on people who were never going to be fair to us," Elena said. "It means we build our own strength, prove our own innocence, and when we come back to that chamber, we come back on our terms, not theirs." The shuttle continued its long journey back toward Sol System, carrying 12 people who had just watched their life's work dismissed by a vote that took less than 4 minutes. None of them spoke much for the remainder of the trip. But something had shifted in the cabin, a quiet, steady resolve that would, in the years ahead, spread from that small group to an entire species. When Elena arrived back on Earth, she did not go home to rest. She went directly to a secure briefing room beneath the Geneva Coordination Center, where representatives from every major spacefaring nation had already gathered, alerted hours earlier by an emergency transmission. The mood in the room was heavy, but not broken. Grief, Elena had learned long ago, could look very different depending on the people carrying it. In this room, grief looked like focus. She stood at the head of the table and laid out what she knew, the verdict, the false charges, her suspicion that the evidence had been engineered by someone with a direct stake in Earth's expansion plans. She did not have proof. But she had something else, the absolute certainty that proof existed somewhere, waiting to be found, and the conviction that Earth could survive long enough to find it. "We have been cut off from Concord trade, technology sharing, and diplomatic protection," she told the room. "That means we lose access to medical resources our colonies depend on. It means our expansion into the frontier stops overnight. It means every advantage we thought we had is gone." She paused, looking around the table at faces she had worked alongside for years, engineers, military strategists, resource planners, scientists. "But it also means no one is watching us anymore," she said. "No one is expecting anything from us. We have time, and we have reason, and if we use both wisely, we will not simply survive this. We will come back stronger than anyone in that chamber can imagine." By the end of that night, the first outline of a plan had taken shape, 3 pillars that would define the next years of human effort. The first was survival, securing food, medicine, and fuel independence for every colony that had depended on Concord trade. The second was truth, assembling a dedicated team to trace the fabricated evidence back to its source, no matter how long it took. The third pillar was spoken about only briefly, in careful terms, by a quiet engineer named Priya Kessler, who suggested that Earth would eventually need more than proof to be taken seriously again. It would need strength that could not be dismissed or ignored. No one in that room fully understood, that first night, how far each of those 3 pillars would eventually be built. They only understood that the alternative, accepting the verdict, accepting exile as final, was not something any of them were willing to do. Elena Voss folded the exile decree and placed it in a drawer in her office, where it would remain for the next several years, a reminder of exactly what had been done to her people, and exactly what she intended to answer with when the time came. The long silence and the Armada. 7 years passed, and Earth did not fall. The Concorde's economic analysts had predicted, in the confidential report circulated quietly among a handful of trade delegations, that humanity's colonies would collapse within 18 months of losing access to Concorde medical supply chains and fuel processing agreements. It was a reasonable projection based on every precedent the Concorde had ever observed. Species cut off from galactic trade tended to fracture, their outer settlements abandoned as resources were pulled back to protect the core worlds. It was, according to every model the analysts built, simply how these things went. The models were wrong. What the analysts had failed to account for was not a strategic advantage or a hidden alliance. It was something far harder to measure, a species that had spent its entire history solving problems it was told could not be solved. Cut off from Concorde technology sharing, Earth's engineers did not slow down. They redirected. Fusion research that had been quietly stalled for a decade, deprioritized in favor of cheaper Concorde energy imports, suddenly received every resource Earth could spare. Medical researchers who had grown used to importing treatments from Concorde pharmaceutical worlds began, out of necessity, developing their own, slower at first, then faster than anyone expected, as failure was no longer an option they could afford to accept. It was not painless. A colony called New Meridian, 3 years into the exile, lost over 400 people to a respiratory illness that could have been treated with medicine sitting in Concorde warehouses less than 20 light-years away. Medicine Earth was no longer permitted to purchase. Elena Voss kept the names of everyone who died on New Meridian in a private file on her desk, not as a monument to grief, but as a reminder of exactly what the false verdict had cost, and exactly why the work could not stop. The second pillar of the plan, the pursuit of truth, moved more slowly, but it moved. A small team led by a forensic data analyst named Halvard Reyes had spent years combing through every fragment of information that could be gathered about the original evidence package presented to the Concorde. It was slow, frustrating work. Most of the original sensor logs and inspection reports were sealed behind Concorde security systems Earth no longer had access to. Progress came in small pieces, a discrepancy in a timestamp here, a metadata inconsistency there, clues gathered from public trade records and the testimony of a handful of sympathetic traders who still did business quietly with human contacts despite the exile. The breakthrough, when it came, arrived from an unexpected source. High Counselor Ith Solen had spent 7 years unable to fully silence the doubt that had first crept into his mind on the night of Earth's exile. He had reviewed the case files more times than he could count, always alone, always late at night, always telling himself he was simply being thorough. But thoroughness, over time, had hardened into something closer to certainty. The evidence against Earth was too clean. Real intelligence had gaps. This did not. He did not act rashly. Ith was, above all else, a patient man, and he understood that accusing a powerful trade coalition of fabricating evidence without absolute proof would end his career and accomplish nothing. So he waited, and he watched, and he quietly began cross-referencing shipping manifests from the Elon Compact against the timeline of the alleged incidents at the water reclamation facility that had formed the centerpiece of the case against Earth. What he found, after months of careful, secret work, was a supply shipment recorded as arriving at the facility 3 days before the sabotage was alleged to have occurred, a shipment of components that had no legitimate use in water reclamation technology, but a very clear use in staging a controlled, deniable act of sabotage designed to look like an outside attack. I did not know who to trust with what he had found. He was fairly certain that bringing it directly to the Concorde would result in the evidence quietly disappearing before it could be examined. So he did something that would have been unthinkable to him 7 years earlier. He reached out, through a trusted intermediary on a neutral trade world, to see if there remained any channel of communication with Earth at all. It took months for the message to reach Halvard Reyes's team. When it did, and when they confirmed what the shipping manifest showed, the mood in Earth's investigation office shifted from cautious progress to genuine momentum. It was not, on its own, complete proof. But it was the first solid thread in a case that had taken years to even begin unraveling, and once pulled, it did not stop unraveling. While the truth was being slowly reassembled piece by piece, the third pillar of Earth's plan was taking shape far from any Concorde sensor grid, in a series of shipyards built into the hollowed interiors of asteroids scattered across the outer edge of Sol system. The engineer chosen to lead this effort was a woman named Priya Kessler, the same quiet voice who had first raised the idea on the night of Elena Voss's return. Priya was not a soldier and had never wanted to be one. She had spent the early part of her career designing orbital habitats and long-range transport vessels. But she understood, perhaps better than anyone else in that first planning session, that proof of innocence alone might not be enough to guarantee Earth's safety in a galaxy that had already shown it was willing to fabricate a war rather than share a resource corridor fairly. Under her direction, Earth built its first true deep space fleet, not from Concorde blueprints, which were no longer available, but from first principles, reverse-engineered fragments of old trade-era technology, and years of trial and error that cost time, resources, and occasionally lives during early testing failures. The ships that emerged from those hidden asteroid shipyards were not elegant by Concorde standards. They were built for endurance, redundancy, and firepower that had never been calibrated against Concorde treaty limitations, because Earth was no longer bound by any treaty at all. Pilots trained on simulators years before there were enough ships to fly. Priya insisted on this, over the objections of military planners who wanted to move faster. A pilot who has practiced 1,000 failures in simulation, she said, will make fewer real ones when it matters. She promoted commanders not for aggression, but for patience and precision, the same qualities that had defined the entire 7-year effort since the exile began. Rethvin Surar, meanwhile, had grown comfortable. 7 years of unchallenged control over the frontier corridor had brought the Elon Compact enormous wealth, and Rethvin had risen within the Compact's leadership as a result. He gave little thought to Earth anymore, considering the matter closed and largely forgotten by the wider Concorde. He did not know that a Concorde High Counselor had spent months quietly building a case against him, nor that the case had found its way into human hands. The confrontation, when it finally came, did not begin with violence. It began with a single unregistered vessel that appeared at the edge of Concorde-monitored space, broadcasting an old diplomatic frequency that had not been used in 7 years. Behind it, spread across a formation that Concorde sensors struggled at first to fully register, was Earth's assembled fleet, not attacking, not advancing, simply present, in numbers and capability the Concorde's analysts had never accounted for in any of their models. Elena Voss, 7 years older and considerably more tired, stood once again in the Concorde's chamber, this time flanked not by a small diplomatic staff but by Halvard Reyes carrying 7 years of painstakingly assembled evidence, and by a formal transmission link showing Priya Kessler's fleet holding position at the border, a silent demonstration that Earth had not returned to beg. Solen rose from his seat before the vote could even be called, and for the first time in his long career, spoke against the coalition that had shaped Concorde policy on the frontier corridor for over a decade. The evidence he had gathered, combined with what Earth's own investigators had assembled, was laid out in full for the assembled delegates, and this time there was no clean, tidy narrative to hide behind. There were gaps, contradictions, and a shipping manifest with a very specific date that Rethvin Surar could not explain. The chamber that had once fallen silent to deliver a false verdict against Earth fell silent again, this time as the truth was finally spoken aloud, 7 years too late for the people of New Meridian, but not too late for what came after. Earth did not ask for revenge. Elena made that clear in her closing statement. Earth asked only for the record to reflect what had actually happened, and for a seat at the table that would never again be so easily taken away. The vote, when it finally came, was not unanimous. Rethven-Seorar's allies fought to delay, to obscure, to protect what remained of the Elon Compact's position. But the evidence was too complete to dismiss a second time, and the fleet at the border, quiet and patient, was a reminder that Earth would not simply walk away if the truth was buried again. Humanity's exile ended not with celebration, but with the quiet, hard-won satisfaction of a debt finally acknowledged. Elena Voss returned to Earth one final time not as an ambassador pleading for reinstatement, but as the leader of a species that had spent 7 years turning betrayal into strength, and had returned to the table not weaker than before, but transformed.